The North Korea missiles now are confirmed to have fallen within Japanese waters at a time when we know that the U.S. envoy Song Kim is there. Is this anything more than another cry for attention while we have all of these high-profile officials, including Wang Yi, in the region, just touring and talking to each other?
Well, it's a big picture strategy of provocation. I think the U.S. wants strategic patience. Maybe China wants the same thing. But for North Korea, it doesn't have many resources. So what it does do is provoke at the right time in front of the right people to garner a global audience. And its timing is always impeccable in terms of maximizing its bargaining chips for a negotiation, which is what this is all about in the big picture, is a multidimensional chessboard in terms of strategic negotiations to maximize what it can get. That's just not just economic, it's military, diplomatic, and also in terms of respect from the international community.
So on that chessboard, whose move is next? Where are we in the dynamic between all of these great powers and where North Korea stands?
Well, North Korea and South Korea, the whole Korean Peninsula, in terms of history and culture, they kind of view itself as sort of a shrimp between two whales, the U.S. and China. And that's where it is today, actually. Things have ramped up, but I think basically the parties want the same thing, everyone. They want peace and security, but that's the end goal. The strategic playbook in terms of how to get there differs, and that's where I think can be some type of miscalculation. North Korea is a leader on this chessboard, and arguably all chessboards. It's preemptive, it's provocative, and everyone else is just reactionary, watching and reacting. And you don't want to play defense the whole game because you're not going to win the game. So it becomes an issue of what's North Korea going to do next. And so I think North Korea is playing it very strategically, and it knows that the South Korean presidency, Moon Jae-in, basically that window of opportunity is closing quickly because his presidency will end next year.
When it comes to the Biden administration's approach to the Koreas, is it unhelpful at this point that we don't seem to have much of a coherent or at least outwardly presented strategy yet?
Well, this is another playbook within North Korea's negotiation strategy, is that any incoming U.S. president will have a lot of stuff to deal with. Usually when it comes to North Korean issues in terms of history, North Korea is dealt with on the back end, not the front end. So it's not usually done in the first 10 minutes of the first quarter. It's usually done in the last 10 minutes of the fourth quarter in terms of securing some type of legacy as a peacemaker for a U.S. president. So obviously, as it applies to U.S. President Biden now, he's just kind of going into the presidency, and he has his hands full with Afghanistan and everything else, dealing with transportation, dealing with recalls, et cetera. And North Korea knows this exactly. It knows how to play the international players. It knows how to look at internally in terms of the minutia of U.S. domestic politics, again, to maximize its utility. And it's playing a little game of prisoner's dilemma and game theory, where two parties or multiple parties are trying to understand strategically whether they should cooperate or betray one another. And North Korea is a master at prisoner's dilemma and game theory.
Australia has entered into a new alliance with the UK and US, which would allow it to procure nuclear-powered submarines. What do you say to the proposition that South Korea should get off the defense, get on the offense, and also be given access to technology like this?
Well, it's constrained, South Korea is, in terms of securing nuclear weapons, but it'll try to do everything up to but probably right up to that point, but not exceeding it. So that's why it's ramping up submarine capabilities, SLBMs, as the segment before talked about. President Moon Jae-in of South Korea talked about this asymmetry, which is a fancy word for unequal balance, where North Korea has more relative, strength in terms of military capability vis-a-vis South Korea. And especially when you're bordering one another, and especially if one country is saying this rhetoric and doing all these types of military exercises, that you don't want to sort of be in an asymmetric situation on the downside. That's not good militarily, diplomatically. It can also rattle the financial markets, because everyone kind of presumes that North Korea is just kind of saber rattling. But saber rattling can be miscalculated, because as the piece before talked about a red line, one country's red line may not be another country's red line. And if we look at history, for example, World War I, a very small event can lead to a domino effect where a lot of parties get involved and things become rational to emotional, not just North Korea, as the segment suggested, but arguably all players, because war is not a fully rational game.
No, and deeply uncomfortable and risky for Beijing as well, right? What would you be expecting from presidency, given that, as we spoke about earlier, he has such a full domestic agenda?
Yeah, that's right. And that's why he's sending the Prime Minister Wang Yi, who's extremely sophisticated, extremely intelligent and smart. And so that person's a great representative for Xi Jinping. And so sending, Wang Yi over to Southeast Asia and capping it off in South Korea, where there's a lot at stake militarily, is a very strategic move. What does China want? The PRC leadership? It wants strategic patience. It probably wants to have three-party talks, the PRC and the two Koreas, and basically not include the U.S. obviously. South Korea, President Moon Jae-in probably wants to talk directly with North Korea. That's been delayed throughout his presidency, but I think the PRC has to get involved. The UN, United Nations, probably wants six-party talks, but that's to help make the process a little bit transparent, because the six-party talks, as I've commented here before on Bloomberg, it doesn't make much progress, but at the same time, it helps slow the devolving process. If things, it basically slows things down so things don't spiral out of control. The process and trying to get into North Korea's head becomes a little bit less opaque and a little bit more transparent. Not to say that it is transparent, but relatively from the baseline, it becomes a little bit more transparent.